What happens when a man spits in the face of the wife of the most dangerous person in Harlem and then goes to drink grappa, laughing about it, believing he will wake up tomorrow and open his restaurant as if nothing happened? Harlem, New York. It was a Saturday, the 12th of October, 1957, approximately 7 o'clock in the evening. When Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson settled into his armchair in the living room of his apartment on 150th Street, between 7th and 8th Avenue, wearing a burgundy silk robe over a white undershirt, leather slippers that Mamie had given him for their 19th wedding anniversary, and reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, glasses that only 4 people in the world had ever seen him wear, because Bumpy Johnson, the man whose whispered name could silence entire city blocks, the man whose underground empire generated more money in a month than most legitimate businesses on Lenox Avenue earned in a year, would never allow the streets to see him in anything less than absolute command. He looked for once like an ordinary husband on an ordinary Saturday evening. The apartment smelled of fresh coffee, warm parquet floors, and Chanel No. 5, Mamie's only luxury, ordered every month directly from Bergdorf Goodman on 5th Avenue. 4 telephones sat on a small table against the wall near the hallway. 4 separate lines, 4 direct wires into 4 different corners of criminal Harlem. In any given week, those phones rang hundreds of times, disputes to settle, payments to confirm, warnings to deliver, alliances to maintain. But on Saturday evenings between 7 and 8, those phones were silent. This was the 1 hour in the week that belonged entirely to Bumpy and Mamie. No empire, no soldiers, no business. Just a husband reading Langston Hughes aloud while his wife fastened pearl earrings in front of the hallway mirror. Mayme Johnson, born in 1911 in Macon, Georgia, raised in a family that valued education and dignity above all else, a woman who had chosen to marry a man whose occupation she never discussed in polite company and whose enemies she never acknowledged in any company, stood before the mirror in a cream-colored dress that fell just below her knees. The fabric was cotton with a subtle floral print, modest but elegant, the kind of dress a pastor's wife might wear to Sunday dinner. She was fastening her pearl earrings, a pair that Bumpy had purchased at Tiffany & Company on 5th Avenue for $412 on their 10th wedding anniversary. She wore them every Saturday, every single Saturday for 12 years. The right earring had a clasp that had loosened over time, and Mamie kept meaning to have it repaired, but it held well enough if she was careful, and the earrings were too precious, not in monetary value, but in what they represented, to leave at a jeweler's bench even for a day. She was going to dinner with 2 friends, Clara Hopkins, wife of Reverend James Hopkins of the Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street, a woman whose social standing in Harlem was unimpeachable and whose husband's sermons drew 1,200 congregants every Sunday, and Dorothy Moore, a schoolteacher at PS 136 on 135th Street, unmarried, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, the kind of woman who read James Baldwin and argued about him at dinner tables. 3 respectable women of Harlem going out for Italian food at a new restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Nothing special, nothing dangerous, a Saturday ritual of friendship and pasta and conversation. The restaurant was called La Stella, the Star, located on Lenox Avenue between 126th and 127th Streets. It had opened 3 months earlier, and word on the avenue was that the veal was the best north of Little Italy, that the wine list was surprisingly decent for Harlem, and that the owner, an Italian man from East Harlem, had invested serious money in the decor, checkered tablecloths, candles in wax-covered Chianti bottles, a jukebox stocked with Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra, the kind of place that tried to be charming and, by most accounts, succeeded. Bumpy looked up from his book as Mamie checked her reflection one final time. He suggested sending Jimmy Lee Williams with her. Jimmy Lee, his driver and bodyguard, 34 years old, a former light heavyweight boxer who had abandoned the ring 3 years prior when Bumpy offered him a salary triple his fight purse. Mamie waved the suggestion away with a laugh. "I am going to eat pasta, not start a war." Bumpy smiled. He rose from the armchair, crossed the room, and kissed her forehead. Then he said a phrase that, within 6 hours, would echo through every action he took that night, a phrase that would sound entirely different by dawn. "In my Harlem, nothing can threaten you. Every stone on these streets knows whose wife you are." Mamie smiled, touched his cheek, turned toward the door. "But before we go any further, remember one thing. In this story, there is a moment that almost nobody knows about. A moment in a smoke-filled back room of a billiard hall on 143rd Street when Bumpy Johnson spoke 9 words, quietly, looking into the eyes of a man who had just asked him the most dangerous question of the night. 9 words that explain everything: why he did what he did, why he did it the way he did, and why this story became the unwritten law that every criminal in Harlem would obey for the next 20 years. Those 9 words are the most important part of everything you will hear today, but we will get to them at the very end. Because to truly understand them, you need to first walk through this entire night, from a pearl earring to a note written in 7 words. Mamie stepped out of the building at 7:12 in the evening, cream dress, pearl earrings, the smile of a woman looking forward to a pleasant night with friends. She had no idea that in 86 minutes that dress would carry someone else's saliva. And the man whose saliva it was, he was already living the final hours of his life. He simply did not know it yet. If you want to find out how this incredible story ends, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss our next videos. The autumn air on 150th Street was warm for October, one of those evenings when Harlem seemed to exhale after a long week, when stoops filled with neighbors and the smell of fried chicken drifted from open kitchen windows. Mamie walked south toward the taxi stand on 148th Street. She passed Mrs. Delilah Crawford's flower shop, already closed for the evening, and the barber shop where Bumpy held court every weekday morning, also dark. She passed 2 young men sitting on a brownstone stoop who recognized her and nodded respectfully, not because they feared her, but because in Harlem in 1957, Mayme Johnson carried a gravity that had nothing to do with her husband and everything to do with the way she moved through the world. Upright, dignified, untouchable. Clara was waiting at the taxi stand. Dorothy arrived 2 minutes later. The 3 women climbed into a yellow cab at 7:21. Clara gave the driver the address, La Stella, Lenox Avenue between 126th and 127th. The driver, a middle-aged Irishman from Hell's Kitchen, glanced in the rearview mirror at 3 well-dressed black women heading to an Italian restaurant and said nothing. The cab pulled into traffic. 8:32. The cab stopped in front of La Stella. The neon sign above the door glowed red and green, the colors of the Italian flag, reflected in the rain puddles on the sidewalk from an afternoon shower. Through the plate glass window, the restaurant looked exactly as advertised: warm light, checkered tablecloths, candles, a crowd of about 40 diners. The jukebox was visible near the back wall, its colored lights cycling through blue and amber. Dean Martin was singing "That's Amore," and the music spilled onto the sidewalk every time the front door opened. Mamie paid the driver. The three women stepped onto the curb. Clara adjusted her hat. Dorothy checked her lipstick in a compact mirror. Mamie smoothed the front of her cream dress and pushed open the door. The smell hit them first: garlic, olive oil, fresh bread, melted cheese, and beneath it all, the faint sweetness of red wine. The restaurant was louder inside than it appeared from the street, conversations overlapping, silverware clinking against ceramic plates, the jukebox competing with laughter from a large table near the kitchen where 6 Italian men in open-collared shirts were celebrating something with raised glasses. The clientele was predominantly Italian, families from East Harlem, a few white couples who had driven uptown for what they considered an exotic dining experience, and 5 or 6 black families seated at smaller tables near the kitchen, away from the windows, away from the prime real estate of the dining room. A young maître d', barely 20, in a white shirt and black vest, stepped forward with menus in hand. He smiled. "Good evening, ladies. Table for 3. He began leading them toward the window. A nice table, good light, street view. 3 steps into the dining room, and then the owner appeared. Vincent Saratelli emerged from behind the bar like a man who had been watching the door and waiting for exactly this moment. 47 years old, and waiting for a short, 5'6" at most, with a receding hairline that he compensated for with an aggressive comb-over, slick with pomade. A gold chain on a thick neck, visible through 2 unbuttoned shirt buttons. A face that might have been handsome 20 years and 40 pounds ago, now flushed from his 3rd glass of grappa that evening. His hands were thick, his fingernails manicured, a detail that seemed at odds with the rest of him. He stepped directly into the path of the 3 women, blocking the young maître d', who stopped and stepped aside with the practiced deference of an employee who had learned not to contradict his boss. Saratelli looked at the 3 women. His eyes moved from Clara to Dorothy to Mamie. He did not lower his voice. He spoke at a volume that carried to every table within 15 feet. "We don't serve colored at the window. Your tables are in the back, near the kitchen, if there's room." The words landed like a slap. Clara's hand found Mamie's elbow, a reflex, a steadying grip. Dorothy took a half step back, her jaw tightening. The maître d' looked at the floor. 3 diners at the nearest table stopped chewing and stared. Dean Martin kept singing. Mayme Johnson was the wife of a man who, in 25 years, had uttered perhaps a dozen phrases that made hardened men's faces change color. One of those phrases, the quietest, the most final, the most devastating, he would speak tonight, 4 hours from now, and it would rewrite the rules of an entire neighborhood forever. But right now, in this moment, Mamie did not need her husband's words. She had her own. She did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She looked Vincent Saratelli directly in the face, a gaze so steady that the gold chain on his chest seemed to shrink, and said, in a voice that was calm and clear and carried just as far as his had, "We want a table at the window, and we will have one." Something shifted in Saratelli's expression, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. He was not accustomed to being contradicted, not in his restaurant, not by anyone, and certainly not by a black woman in a cotton dress who, in his estimation, should have accepted her place at the back of the room with the gratitude of someone permitted to eat in his establishment at all. He stepped closer, so close that Mamie could smell the grappa on his breath, the garlic on his fingers, the pomade in his hair. The dining room was already quieting, forks pausing, conversations trailing off, heads turning. The 6 Italian men at the celebration table fell silent, and Vincent Saratelli did the thing that would cost him his life. He gathered saliva in his mouth, he leaned forward, and he spat, not on the ground beside her, not in her general direction, in her face. The spit landed on Mayme Johnson's left cheek, just below the eye, and it traveled, a slow, obscene slide down her jawline, past the pearl earring, down the curve of her neck, and onto the collar of her cream-colored dress. A dark, wet spot on pale cotton. 40 people in La Stella witnessed it. 40 people watched a man spit in the face of a woman who had done nothing but ask for a table at the window. The restaurant became a vacuum. Every sound ceased except Dean Martin, who continued crooning about Amore from the jukebox speakers, oblivious and absurd. Forks hovered. Glasses froze midway to lips. The bartender's hand stopped polishing a wine glass. Even the kitchen noises, the sizzle of pans, the clatter of dishes, seemed to fade, as if the building itself had inhaled and was holding its breath. Mamie did not flinch. Her eyes did not widen. Her hands did not rise to her face. She stood motionless for 3 seconds, 4, 5. The spit continued its path down her neck. She did not wipe it. She would not give him that satisfaction. She would not grant him the image of a black woman frantically cleaning a white man's contempt from her skin. Instead, she carried it, like evidence, like a sentence that had been passed but not yet read aloud. She turned and walked toward the door. Her right pearl earring, the one with the loosened clasp, the one she kept meaning to repair, the one Bumpy had bought at Tiffany's for their 10th anniversary, fell from her ear and hit the tile floor. A small sound, a tiny clink of pearl against ceramic that, in the dead silence of La Stella, resonated like a starting pistol. Mamie did not stop to pick it up. She pushed through the front door and stepped onto the sidewalk of Lenox Avenue. Clara followed, crying. Dorothy followed, shaking with rage. Behind them, inside the warm glow of La Stella, Vincent Saratelli turned to his audience of 40 stunned diners, spread his arms wide, and grinned. What? They think because they live in Harlem, Harlem belongs to them. Harlem belongs to those who pay the rent. And the rent, I pay it. Scattered, nervous laughter from a few tables. The maitre d' picked up the menus from the floor where he had dropped them. The bartender resumed polishing his glass. The jukebox switched to Sinatra, Come Fly With Me. Life in La Stella resumed. Vincent Saratelli returned to his bar stool, poured himself a 4th grappa, and began telling the bartender the story of the black woman who had the audacity to demand a window table. He did not know that among the 40 diners, at least 3 worked for Bumpy Johnson. One of them, Willie Crawford, a bookmaker who ran numbers on 130th Street, was already walking toward the telephone booth on the corner, but he would not be the first to call. That distinction belonged to Clara Hopkins, who, standing on the sidewalk with tears running down her face, while Mamie sat silently in a taxi with someone else's spit drying on her cheek, found a phone booth on Lenox and 127th, and dialed the number of the apartment on 150th Street. Know what happens when a man begins to lose control of everything he believed was untouchable? In exactly 36 minutes, Bumpy Johnson would hear every detail of what happened in that restaurant. And the man, who was still laughing at his own bar, pouring his 5th grappa, replaying the moment for anyone who would listen, had no idea that a clock had started. A clock that would not stop until a sanitation worker found what was left of Vincent Saratelli's evening in an alley before breakfast, 9:14 in the evening. The phone rang in the apartment on 150th Street. Bumpy was still in his armchair. He had moved on from Hughes to a chess problem. Fischer versus Reshevsky, 1958, a position that Fischer had won with a knight sacrifice that most grandmasters considered reckless and that Bumpy considered beautiful. He reached for the phone without looking up from the board. It was not Mamie. It was Clara Hopkins. Her voice came through the receiver fast, broken, swallowed by sobs and fury. She spoke for 37 seconds. Bumpy listened without interrupting. He did not move. He did not shift in his chair. The chess pieces remained untouched. His breathing did not change. For 37 seconds, Bumpy Johnson absorbed every word, the refusal, the insult, the approach, the spit, the cheek, the earring, the silence, the walk to the door, the laughter behind them, and the only indication that something was happening behind his eyes was a single, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Then he asked 3 questions. His voice was the same as always, low, measured, the voice of a man who weighed every syllable before releasing it. First, "Is she hurt?" Clara said no. Physically no, but the spit on her face. Second, "What is the owner's name?" Vincent Saratelli. Clara had seen the name on the menu. Third, the exact address, La Stella, Lenox Avenue between 126th and 127th. Thank you, Clara. Bumpy said it so gently that Clara would later tell Dorothy, "He thanked me as if I had just signed someone's death warrant. And I suppose that is exactly what I did." Bumpy hung up. He sat motionless for 4 seconds. Then he did something that Jimmy Lee Williams, his driver of 15 years, would describe decades later as the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed in a life spent around frightening men. Bumpy reached across the chessboard, picked up the white king, the piece that represented the player who had the advantage, the player who moved first, the player who was supposed to win, and laid it on its side, gently, precisely, the universal gesture of resignation. Game over. Then he turned to the 4 telephones on the table against the wall, and what followed was 13 minutes that changed the trajectory of an entire night, an entire neighborhood, and one man's remaining hours on Earth. Remember those 9 words I mentioned at the beginning? Right now, in the 20 minutes of silence between the 4th phone call and Mamie's return, while Bumpy stood at the window looking down at Lenox Avenue, watching the Saturday night traffic of his kingdom and thinking the kind of thoughts that leave no fingerprints, right now is when those words crystallized in his mind. He had not spoken them aloud yet, but they already existed. 9 words, heavy as lead, precise as a scalpel. And now the door opened and Mamie stood on the threshold with a red mark on her cheek. 918, first phone. Bumpy dialed from memory. 3 rings. Jimmy, the car, 20 minutes, not the Lincoln, the other one. He meant the black Cadillac Series 62 with New Jersey plates that could not be traced. The car that existed for nights like this, for business that required anonymity, for drives that no one would remember in the morning. 920, second phone, Nat, everything you know about a man named Vincent Saratelli. Restaurant called La Stella on Lenox. You have 30 minutes. Not 40, 30. Nat Pettigrew, 51 years old, Harlem's information broker, a man who carried more secrets in his head than most filing cabinets held in their drawers, understood immediately from the temperature of Bumpy's voice that this was not a routine inquiry. 923, third phone, Freddie, people for quiet work, 1 hour, back room at Jackson's. Freddie Parsons, 43, who managed Bumpy's network of lottery operations across Upper Manhattan, knew what quiet work meant. It meant the opposite of everything loud. No guns, no noise, no witnesses, no traces. 927, fourth phone, the most terrifying of the 4. 7 rings. The voice on the other end was never identified in any account, any memoir, any police report. Bumpy spoke one sentence. I need the stretch of Lenox Avenue between 124th and 127th to have no patrol cars tonight. None. A pause. An answer. Bumpy hung up. The fourth call lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds to remove police presence from 4 blocks of Harlem. Whatever marker Bumpy called in, whatever debt was repaid in those 11 seconds, it was sufficient. By midnight, the 4 blocks of Lenox Avenue surrounding La Stella would be as empty of law enforcement as if they existed in another country. 9:31. The apartment door opened. Mamie stood in the doorway. She had not wiped her face in the taxi. The saliva had dried into an invisible film on her left cheek, but the red irritation where it had landed was still visible. A faint mark, like a handprint that was fading, but not yet gone. Her right earlobe was bare. The pearl earring was gone. Bumpy was already dressed. The burgundy robe was gone. In its place, a dark gray suit, expertly tailored, the fabric so dark it was nearly black. A white shirt, a fedora, and gloves, calfskin, black, butter soft, despite the fact that it was a warm October evening and no man in Harlem needed gloves. The gloves were not for warmth. They were for a purpose that Mamie understood without asking. He crossed the room to her, took her face in both hands, gently, the way you hold something precious that has been damaged. He looked at the mark on her cheek. His thumbs traced the line where the spit had traveled. His eyes followed the path from just below her eye, down the jaw, past the empty earlobe where the pearl should have been, to the faint stain on the cream collar of her dress. He studied the geography of her humiliation with the attention of a man memorizing a map that he intended to redraw. By breakfast, every person in this city will know what it means to disrespect my wife. He kissed her forehead, held the kiss for 3 seconds, then released her face, stepped past her, and walked out the door. Mamie closed it behind him, turned the lock. Then she walked to his armchair, sat down before the chessboard with the fallen white king, and waited. She did not know the details of what would happen that night. She had never asked for details in 20 years, and Bumpy had never offered them. But she knew her husband, and she knew that Vincent Saratelli had woken up that morning for the last time without understanding that this day, this ordinary Saturday, this day of checkered tablecloths and grappa and gold chains, was his last full day on earth. The black Cadillac with New Jersey plates was idling at the curb when Bumpy emerged from the building at 9:34. Jimmy Lee Williams behind the wheel, hands at 10 and 2, engine warm, the car facing south toward 143rd Street, where Jackson's billiard hall waited with 7 men and a locked back room. Bumpy opened the rear door, slid onto the leather seat, and closed the door with a soft click. He did not speak, not a word for the entire 11-minute drive. Jimmy Lee would recall this years later in a conversation with a journalist who never published it. I drove him for 15 years. I saw him calm, angry, thoughtful, amused. But that night I saw something else, something I do not have a word for. The air in the car dropped 10 degrees. I am not exaggerating. I felt the cold. It was like sitting in a car with a man who had already left his body and sent something else in his place, something patient and precise and absolutely terrible. 10:02. The back room of Jackson's billiard hall on 143rd Street. A single light bulb hung above the billiard table, casting a cone of yellow light that made everything outside its radius disappear into shadow. Cigarette smoke layered the air in horizontal strata. 7 men sat around a table that was not designed for meetings. It was a card table, small and square, with a green felt surface, scarred by cigarette burns and water rings. But tonight it served a different purpose. Nat Pettigrew, 51, the information broker, Freddie Parsons, 43, the operations manager, Samuel Big Sam Taylor, behind whom stood a network of 20 young men who would do whatever Bumpy instructed. 2 neighborhood men whose names were never recorded and never spoken aloud, and 2 more, seated in the far corner, away from the light, whose presence in that room communicated the severity of the situation more clearly than any words could. These were the men Bumpy called for quiet work. They had no nicknames. They had no public profiles. They existed in the spaces between Harlem's official history, and they preferred it that way. Bumpy entered, and 7 men stood simultaneously, not from politeness, from something involuntary, a physical response to the expression on his face that their bodies interpreted before their minds could process it. Bumpy did not greet them, did not shake hands, did not ask about families or health or business. He sat at the head of the card table, removed his gloves, and placed them in front of him, parallel, precise, one beside the other. 7 men watched his hands. The hands did not tremble, not a single tremor. These were the hands of a man who had already made a decision and was now simply waiting for the details to arrange themselves. He spoke 17 words. His voice was so low that the men leaned forward to hear, and in that leaning, that collective tilt of 7 bodies toward one voice, the geometry of the room shifted. Bumpy was not asking. He was not discussing. He was informing. This evening, Vincent Saratelli spat in my wife's face. Tell me everything about him, right now. Nat Pettigrew began talking. What unfolded over the next 8 minutes was an X-ray of a man's life. Every bone, every organ, every weakness exposed under the harsh light above the billiard table. The restaurant, a front. The real money came from the basement, where a bookmaking operation handled bets on baseball and horse racing for the Italian population of East Harlem and parts of the Bronx. $20,000 a month in turnover. 30% went to Tony Bender, lieutenant of Vito Genovese, acting boss of the most powerful Mafia family in New York. 10% went to Sergeant Paul McCarthy of the 128th Precinct, payment for the convenient blindness of patrol officers who never noticed that 15 to 20 men gathered in a restaurant basement every evening. Staff, 12 people. Chef, an Italian from Brooklyn. 2 waiters, his nephews. A dishwasher, a Puerto Rican named Ramon, who hated Saratelli because the man owed him 3 weeks of wages and had responded to his complaints with a racial slur that was creative even by 1957 standards. A bookkeeper, a gray-haired man named Maury Feldman, who carried an envelope to Tony Bender every Thursday and got drunk every Thursday night afterward because he understood that eventually the federal government would come looking for those envelopes. Suppliers, meat from Luigi Campanelli at the Fulton Fish Market, wine from the Rosso brothers in Brooklyn, both under Genovese control. Saratelli's personal life, wife left him 2 years ago, lived alone in the apartment above the restaurant, no children, no close friends, a man whose social circle consisted entirely of people who owed him money or whom he owed favors. The room held its breath. 7 men waited for Bumpy's response, and every one of them knew the next words out of his mouth would determine whether this night would be an ordinary settling of accounts or the beginning of a war with the most powerful Mafia family in New York City. They did not know that in the 30 seconds of silence between Nat's warning and Bumpy's first word, the formula had crystallized in Johnson's mind. 9 words, solid as granite, that would transform doubt into a death sentence. And then Nat raised his hand. Boss, I need to tell you something about Saratelli before you make a decision. Saratelli pays Genovese. Not directly, through Tony Bender, through his people in East Harlem. If we touch Saratelli, we touch a Genovese man. Silence filled the back room like smoke. The Genovese family, 1,000 soldiers, police on payroll, judges in pockets, politicians on leashes, the kind of organization that could make a man disappear so thoroughly that even his ghost would not know where to look. Bumpy was quiet for 5 seconds. 10. Then he spoke, and his voice had not changed, not in volume, not in pitch, not in cadence, the same low, measured tone. But something behind the words had shifted, something that Freddie Parsons would later describe as the difference between a man talking and a law being read. Genovese is not my enemy. Saratelli is not my enemy. My enemy is a man who believes he can spit in my wife's face and wake up in the morning. That enemy will cease to exist before sunrise, and Genovese will send me flowers with an apology. Because Genovese is a smart man, and smart men do not start wars over an idiot who spits at women. Bumpy picked up the black billiard ball from the table, rolled it in his palm, slowly, heavy, smooth, cold, a sphere of solid weight in the hand of a man who had just decided another man's fate with the same certainty with which gravity decides the fate of everything it touches. Then he set the ball down in the corner of the table, alone, separated from all the others. And right now, in this exact second, as Bumpy set that black billiard ball in the corner of the table, the 9 words crossed from thought into decision. He had not yet spoken them aloud. That would happen in 40 minutes, in this same back room, when Nat Pettigrew asked him one final question, and when Bumpy answered, Nat Pettigrew, a man who had spent 30 years trading in other people's secrets and believed himself impossible to surprise, would fall silent for a full minute and lower his eyes, not from fear, from the understanding that the man sitting across from him was not a gangster planning revenge, but a husband executing a law older than any criminal code ever written. What exactly did Bumpy say? Soon. We are almost there. But first, the net had to close. Bumpy turned to the 2 nameless men in the corner. You 2, stay. The other 5 stood and walked out. The door closed. What was discussed in the next 11 minutes was never recorded, never retold, and never became the subject of any police report. But the result of that conversation would be visible to all of Harlem in 8 hours, in an alley behind La Stella at 6:11 on a Sunday morning, 11 o'clock Saturday night. Harlem was alive with its weekend pulse, jazz spilling from doorways on 7th Avenue, laughter bouncing off brownstone facades, taxis honking at intersections, the eternal Saturday choreography of a neighborhood that worked hard all week and played harder on the weekend. But on 4 blocks of Lenox Avenue, between 124th and 127th, an invisible occupation had begun. Freddie Parsons's people took their positions with the naturalness of actors stepping onto a stage they had rehearsed on 1,000 times. A young man leaned against a lamppost on 125th, lighting a cigarette with the unhurried ease of someone with nowhere to be. 2 men sat on the stoop of a brownstone on 126th, sharing a bottle in a paper bag, laughing occasionally, the universal camouflage of Harlem nightlife. A woman appeared in a second-floor window above a dry cleaner's on 127th. And this was Bumpy's genius, the detail that separated competent planning from brilliant planning. A man loitering on a street corner at midnight is suspicious. A woman in a window, leaning on the sill, watching the avenue below, that is scenery. That is Harlem. By 11:30, every alley, every passageway between buildings, every fire escape on 4 blocks of Lenox Avenue was under surveillance. 14 people, invisible, patient. Each knew their role and nothing more, Bumpy's information architecture was cellular, each person holding one piece of the puzzle, none holding the complete picture. Simultaneously, Bumpy addressed the Genovese problem with a single telephone call that demonstrated why he had survived 3 decades in a business that killed most of its participants within 5 years. At 11:45, from the telephone in Jackson's billiard hall, he called Frank Lucchese, head of another New York Mafia family, a man with whom Bumpy had maintained a profitable business relationship involving gambling operations in Harlem for over a decade. Bumpy explained the situation in 4 sentences. 4 sentences. No emotion, no embellishment, no requests for sympathy, just facts. Lucchese was quiet for several seconds. Then, "This Saratelli, who is he to veto?" "Nobody. A small fish who pays tribute through third parties. Vito does not even know his name. Do what you need to do. If Vito calls, and he will not call, I will tell him that his man insulted the wife of an ally. Vito will understand. Italians also have wives." 1 phone call. That was all it took. Bumpy had removed the Genovese shield from Saratelli with the precision of a surgeon peeling away a bandage before the operation. The protection that Saratelli believed made him invulnerable. The name he dropped in every argument, the invisible armor he wore with the swagger of a man who confused borrowed power with his own, was gone, dissolved, evaporated into the cigarette smoke of a billiard hall back room. Saratelli was naked now, exposed, alone in a world that he did not yet realize had turned hostile around him, while he sat at his bar, drinking grappa and laughing about a woman he had spat upon. Freddie reported by phone at 11:50. "Everything is in place. 14 eyes. No blind spots. A mouse could not get through." Bumpy replied, "I do not need a mouse. I need a rat. A large Italian rat with a gold chain around his neck. When it leaves the Neptune, report. Do not touch. Only watch. The touching, I will handle myself." And Bumpy smiled in the darkness of the back room, the same smile that Nat Pettigrew would see one more time 20 years later in a barber shop on 7th Avenue when he would recount 9 words to a young journalist, 9 words that still caught in Nat's throat after 2 decades. Lenox Avenue from above, if you could have looked down from the rooftops that night, would have revealed a geometry of waiting. Yellow cones of streetlight, dark gaps of alleys, and in every gap the glowing ember of a cigarette, 14 embers, 14 pairs of eyes. And Saratelli, who at that exact moment was counting the evening's receipts at the register of La Stella, $712 a good night, had no idea that he was already surrounded, that every exit from his life had been quietly sealed while he tallied his profits and poured his 5th grappa and told the bartender for the 3rd time the story of the black woman who had the nerve to demand a window table. "I showed her where her place is," he said, and laughed. The bartender laughed. One of them was laughing for the last time. 1 o'clock in the morning, Sunday, October the 13th. La Stella was closed. The last employee, Ramon, the dishwasher who was owed 3 weeks of wages, had left at 12:45, walking out the back door into the alley with his shoulders hunched against the chill that had finally arrived with midnight. He did not look back. He did not lock the door. He had been given very specific instructions by a man who visited him at his apartment that afternoon, a man who handed him $50 in cash, promised him a dishwashing job at a different restaurant starting Monday, and asked him only one question: "Does the window lock on the fire escape still stick?" Ramon had answered honestly. It had not locked since July. The man thanked him and left. Ramon understood, in the way that people who survive in difficult environments understand without needing explanations, that the $50 and the new job were not charity. They were a transaction, and the price of the transaction was a window that did not lock and a back door left open. Saratelli locked the front door at 12:50, climbed the stairs to his apartment on the second floor, changed from his restaurant shirt into a leather jacket, came back down through the back door into the alley. This was habit. Every Saturday, the same routine, as predictable as a clock pendulum. 3 blocks south on Lenox to the Neptune bar. Grappa until 2. Walk home alone. Because Vincent Saratelli believed that the name Genovese was a bulletproof vest, and a man wearing a bulletproof vest does not need bodyguards or weapons or even basic caution. Freddie's voice on the phone at 1:03 in the morning. The rat is out, moving south on Lenox, alone. But Bumpy did not intercept him on the street. The plan had changed, or rather the plan had evolved, because Bumpy Johnson did not change plans. He refined them, the way a chess player refines a strategy when a better move reveals itself. Instead of confronting Saratelli on Lenox Avenue, where even at 1 in the morning a witness might appear, where a shout might carry, where variables could not be controlled, Bumpy would wait for him at home, in his own apartment, in his own chair, because the message was not just about what would happen to Saratelli. The message was about where it would happen, in the one place a man is supposed to be safe, in the one place that is supposed to be his alone. Bumpy would take that from him, too. He would take the restaurant, the dignity, the safety of home, the protection of the Genovese name, and finally, the only thing Saratelli had left. He would take everything. Finally, because Saratelli had taken something that could not be quantified, the dignity of Mayme Johnson, and the only proportionate response was totality. While Saratelli walked south toward the Neptune, 2 shadows climbed the fire escape at the rear of the La Stella building. The window, Ramon's window, the one that had not locked since July, slid open without resistance. 2 men entered the dark apartment above the restaurant. They moved through the rooms without flashlights, navigating by the ambient glow of street lamps filtering through thin curtains. They checked each room: kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, living room. They noted the layout, the furniture, the angles. Then they took their positions, one by the door, one by the window, and waited. 20 minutes later, a 3rd man entered through the same window. This man carried with him the smell of Cuban cigar. Monte Cristo No. 2, a smoke so distinctive that only one person in all of Harlem was known to favor it. This man sat down in Saratelli's armchair, the best chair in the apartment, positioned facing the front door, and lit his cigar. The ember glowed orange in the darkness, bright, then dim, bright, then dim, like a lighthouse warning ships away from rocks, like the slow pulse of something alive and waiting. 1:47 in the morning. Through the apartment's thin walls, they could hear the muffled sounds of Lenox Avenue, a distant car horn, a woman's laugh from a block away, the faint bass line of jazz from a club that had not yet closed. The apartment itself was silent except for a mantel clock on the fireplace, a cheap brass clock with a loud tick that filled every room with its metronomic insistence. Tick, 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 each tick a subtraction. Each tick 1 second fewer in the remaining life of Vincent Saratelli, who was at that moment sitting at the Neptune bar, 4 blocks south, drinking his 7th grappa and telling the bartender, a different audience, the same story, about the black woman and the window table. 2:07 in the morning. The sound of footsteps on the stairs, heavy, slightly uneven. The gait of a man who has consumed 7 grappas and believes the alcohol has made him more charming rather than less coordinated. The jingle of keys. A key finding a lock on the 3rd attempt. The click of a deadbolt. The door swung open. Darkness. The apartment was dark, which was expected. Saratelli had turned off the lights before leaving, but there was a smell that did not belong, a smell that was wrong. Cuban cigar. Rich, complex, unmistakable. A smell that Saratelli's brain registered before his conscious mind could process it, triggering an alert that manifested as a sudden tightening in his stomach, a prickling at the back of his neck, a hesitation in the doorway that lasted 1 second, 2 seconds. Do not turn on the light, Vincent. It will be better this way. For you, better. The voice came from the darkness, from the direction of the armchair. Low, calm, unhurried, the voice of a man sitting comfortably in someone else's chair, in someone else's apartment at 2 a.m, as if he had been invited, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Saratelli's hand froze at the light switch. His fingers trembled against the wall plate. His eyes, adjusting to the darkness with agonizing slowness, began to assemble shapes from the gloom. The silhouette in the armchair, fedora, cigar, gloves. 2 more silhouettes flanking the room, standing motionless like furniture that breathed. Saratelli's legs buckled. He grabbed the doorframe. His mouth opened but produced only fragments. Who? What? How? The ember of the cigar flared as the man in the armchair inhaled. For a moment, one brief, terrible moment, the orange glow illuminated the lower half of a face, a chin, lips. The lips were smiling. My name is Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. This evening you spat in my wife's face. Sit down, Vincent. We are going to have a very short conversation. The name hit Saratelli like a physical blow. Every Italian in Harlem knew that name. Every Italian in East Harlem knew that name. Every bookmaker, every numbers runner, every restaurant owner, every shopkeeper who operated within the gravitational field of Bumpy Johnson's empire, which was to say, every person who conducted any form of business, legal or otherwise, above 110th Street, knew that name the way sailors know the name of a reef. You learned it. You respected it. You navigated around it. And under no circumstances, none, did you collide with it. Saratelli's mind, even through the fog of 7 grappas, made the connection instantly. The black woman in the cream dress, the pearl earrings, the steady gaze. We want a table at the window. She had not been the wife of a plumber. She had not been the wife of a teacher. She had been the wife of Bumpy Johnson. He had spat in the face of Bumpy Johnson's wife. Saratelli's knees hit the floor before he made a conscious decision to kneel. He grabbed the armrest of a nearby chair and pulled himself into it, collapsing more than sitting, his hands shaking so severely that they made a chattering sound against the wooden arms. You cannot. I am under the protection of Tony Bender. Vito Genovese will. The cigar flared again. The lips were still smiling. Vincent, I made some calls tonight. Friends called friends. And you know what I learned? Vito Genovese does not know your name. You are nobody, Vincent. You are the dirt on someone else's shoe, and you thought you were part of the shoe. Tony Bender is sleeping soundly tonight and has no intention of waking up for a man who spits at women. Italians have honor too, Vincent. Some Italians. Not you. The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes. Not because Bumpy was in a hurry, because there was nothing to discuss. The verdict had been passed hours ago in a living room on 150th Street in front of a chessboard with a fallen king. Everything since then, the phone calls, the intelligence gathering, the deployment of 14 watchers, the removal of the Genovese shield, the entry through the fire escape window, had been logistics. Execution of a sentence already pronounced. 2:16 in the morning. The mantel clock ticked. The pearl earring lay on the table. And in this moment, in this exact moment, Bumpy's face wore an expression that Saratelli could not read, but that the two nameless men against the walls read instantly, the calm of a man who had already spoken his 9 words and knew that the mechanism could not be stopped. Those 9 words, you will learn them in just a few minutes, because we have almost arrived. But first, the earring. First, the last thing Vincent Saratelli would see. Bumpy did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke in what Jimmy Lee once described as a whisper that makes you want to cover your ears, but you cannot. He talked to Saratelli about Mamie, not about himself, about her, about how she had refused to call her husband because she did not want anyone to get hurt, about how she had not wiped the spit from her face for the entire taxi ride home, about how she had walked into their apartment with a wet cheek and an empty earlobe and said, "Do not do anything. Please." "My wife," Bumpy said, "asked me to spare you." "My wife, whose face you spat in before 40 witnesses, asked me not to cause you harm. Do you know what that means, Vincent? It means she is a better person than I am, a much better person." Saratelli began to cry. Not screaming, not begging, crying. Quietly, pathetically, with saliva running down his own chin. The irony, his own saliva on his own chin, a mirror image of what he had done 6 hours earlier, was something he was not capable of appreciating. I did not know whose wife she was. I would never have. Bumpy leaned so close that Saratelli could smell the cigar and the cologne, could feel the warmth of breath on his face. That is exactly the problem, Vincent. You did not spit in her face because she is my wife. You spat in her face because she is black. If she had been a plumber's wife, you would have done the same. A teacher's wife, the same. You did not spit because of me. You spat because of what you are, and that is something I cannot forgive. Silence. Only the ticking of the mantel clock. Each tick a deduction from a balance that was almost empty. Bumpy picked up the pearl earring from the table, the right one, the one with the loosened clasp. It had been retrieved from the tile floor of La Stella at 11 o'clock that evening by one of Bumpy's people who had entered the restaurant as the last customers were leaving, spotted the small white sphere near the entrance, and pocketed it without breaking stride. Such a small thing. A sphere of nacre smaller than a marble, barely weighing an ounce. But in this room, on this table between these two men, it was the heaviest object in the world. Bumpy turned it in his fingers. "Do you know what this earring cost?" "I bought the pair for $412 at Tiffany's on Fifth Avenue. Our 10th wedding anniversary. Mamie wore them every Saturday, every single Saturday for 12 years. And tonight one of them fell on your dirty tile floor because my wife was walking out of your establishment with a stranger's spit on her face." Bumpy placed the earring in his breast pocket. Slowly, deliberately, as if filing away a piece of evidence that would never be needed in any court but had already been entered into a record that mattered more than any legal proceeding. "I will take this with me. And you, Vincent," he did not finish the sentence. He nodded to the two nameless men, put on his hat, walked to the door. "You had 6 hours, Vincent. 6 hours from the moment your spit touched my wife's face. 6 hours during which you could have come to me, gotten on your knees, and begged for forgiveness. Instead, you went to drink grappa and tell a bartender how you put a black woman in her place. You were laughing, Vincent. 6 hours. You spent them on grappa and laughter. Time is up." The door opened. Bumpy stepped through. The door closed. The mantel clock kept ticking. Bumpy descended the stairs, exited through the back door of the restaurant into the alley. Jimmy Lee was waiting in the Cadillac on the corner of 126th. Bumpy slid into the back seat, removed his gloves, reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the pearl earring, held it up to the light of a street lamp. Such a small thing, such a tremendous weight. Home, Jimmy. The car pulled away from the curb. Behind them, in the apartment on the second floor of La Stella, the mantel clock continued to tick. The two nameless men did what they had been summoned to do: quiet work. The final minutes of Vincent Saratelli on this earth unfolded to the accompaniment of a mantel clock and the muffled jazz from a bar 2 doors down that was finally closing for the night. And when it was over, and it was over well before dawn, Lenox Avenue looked exactly as it always did. No sound, no trace, just a slightly ajar back door swaying on its hinges in the pre-dawn breeze, and a shape in the alley that, by 6 a.m, would attract the attention of a man in an orange vest. 6:11 in the morning, Sunday, October the 13th, 1957. Dawn over Harlem was pale pink and cold, with a fog that lay across Lenox Avenue like gauze over a wound. Wilbur Jenkins, 53 years old, a sanitation worker with 20, every day, for 21 years. A small white sphere of nacre, no larger than a marble, tucked against his chest beside his heart. He never explained it to anyone. Those who knew the story did not ask. Those who did not know, even less. 1968. A meeting with a Harlem city councilman at a restaurant on 125th Street. The councilman noticed a small white object in Bumpy's breast pocket and asked casually what it was. Bumpy touched the pocket with 2 fingers, looked at the councilman, and changed the subject. The councilman never asked again. 1972. Bumpy's doctor, during a routine examination, asked him to remove the contents of his pockets. Bumpy placed his wallet, keys, and a pearl earring on the examining table. The doctor picked it up. "What is this?" Bumpy took it back, returned it to his pocket, and said, "The most expensive thing I own." The doctor, who knew Bumpy's net worth, looked confused. Bumpy did not elaborate. 1976. A young numbers runner, new to Bumpy's organization, noticed the earring fall from a jacket pocket during a meeting. He picked it up and held it out. "You dropped this, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy took it, and the expression that crossed his face made the young man take 2 steps backward. "Thank you," Bumpy said softly, and then, even more softly, "Never touch this again." The young man never did. July 1968. Bumpy Johnson collapsed at a table in Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue during a dinner with friends. He was 62 years old. His heart, which had endured 3 decades of stress that would have destroyed most organs within a decade, simply stopped. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. 2,000 people stood on the street outside the funeral home 3 days later. Politicians, gangsters, ministers, school teachers, shopkeepers, children who did not fully understand why their parents were crying but understood that someone important had left. The line stretched 4 blocks. Mamie stood beside the open casket. She was 67 years old. Her hair was silver. She wore a black dress and 1 pearl earring, the left one. She reached into the casket and placed her hand on the breast pocket of Bumpy's suit, his best suit, the dark blue one he wore on Mondays, the one that his tailor had pressed for the final time that morning. Through the fabric she felt it, a small, hard sphere, the right pearl earring, still there. After 21 years, still there. She did not remove it. She left the earring exactly where her husband had carried it for 2 decades, next to his heart. And when the casket lid closed, 2 pearls, the left in Mayme's ear, the right in Bumpy's pocket, were separated by 3 inches of oak, a pair, divided and indivisible, like the 2 people to whom they belonged. That evening, after the funeral, after the 2,000 mourners had dispersed, after the politicians had returned to their offices, and the gangsters to their territories, and the ministers to their churches, Mayme Johnson sat alone in the apartment on 150th Street. The same apartment, the same armchair, the same 4 telephones on the table against the wall, though they had not rung in days and would never ring again. On the chessboard, the board that Bumpy had kept set up for 30 years, always mid-game, always with a problem to solve, 1 piece lay on its side, the white king. She had never moved it, not since that Saturday night 21 years ago, when Bumpy had laid it down before making 4 phone calls that changed everything. It had remained on its side through 2 decades of games played around it, a permanent marker of the night when Bumpy Johnson stopped playing by other people's rules and started enforcing his own. Mamie touched the fallen king with 1 finger. Then she touched her left ear. The pearl was there, cold, smooth, familiar. Its twin was 3 miles away, in a closed casket, in a dark room, in the breast pocket of a man who had carried it for 21 years because a restaurant owner on Lenox Avenue had made the mistake of believing that Harlem belonged to those who paid rent rather than those who bled for it. And somewhere in the drawer of a retired detective named Raymond Cosgrove, a drawer that had been opened only once in 21 years and found empty, there had once been a note, 7 words on white cardboard: respect other men's wives, respect their Harlem. The note was gone, but the words did not need paper to survive. They had been carved into the memory of every person who lived north of 110th Street, passed from mouth to ear in barber shops and on church steps and in the back seats of taxicabs, repeated with the reverence usually reserved for Scripture and the fear usually reserved for prophecy. Because the story of Vincent Saratelli was never really about Vincent Saratelli. He was a footnote, a cautionary parenthetical in the longer sentence of Bumpy Johnson's life. The story was about a pearl earring and 9 words, and a Saturday night when a man who read poetry to his wife was reminded that the world outside their apartment did not share his tenderness, and responded not with the blind rage that the world expected from a man of his reputation, but with the cold, architectural precision of someone who understood that true power is not loud. True power is the ability to make 4 phone calls in 13 minutes and rearrange the physics of an entire neighborhood before sunrise. In the years that followed that October night, the ripple effects spread in concentric circles that touched every corner of Harlem's social and criminal ecosystem. Within a month of Saratelli's disappearance, 3 other Italian-owned businesses on Lenox Avenue, a dry cleaner, a shoe repair shop, and a small grocery, quietly changed their service policies. No more separate sections, no more back tables, no more whispered instructions to employees about which customers received which treatment. These changes were not announced. There were no signs in the windows, no public declarations of equality. The owners simply stopped doing what they had always done, and when asked why, they offered vague explanations about modernizing their customer approach or following new city guidelines that did not actually exist. The truth was simpler and more primal than any guideline. The truth was a body in an alley and a note pinned to a lapel, and the understanding, visceral, immediate, non-negotiable, that the rules of Harlem had been rewritten in a single night by a man who considered disrespect to his wife a capital offense. And if disrespect to Bumpy Johnson's wife carried that price, then what was the price of disrespect to any black woman in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem? Nobody wanted to find out. Nobody needed to find out. The lesson had been taught once, and once was sufficient. By the spring of 1958, 6 months after the incident, something remarkable had happened on Lenox Avenue that no sociologist documented and no newspaper reported. The informal segregation that had persisted inside Harlem's white-owned businesses, the unwritten rules about which tables were for which customers, which entrances were preferred, which level of service was offered to which complexion, had largely evaporated. Not everywhere, not completely. The deeper currents of American racism could not be redirected by a single act of violence, no matter how precisely targeted. But on Lenox Avenue, between 120th and 140th Streets, the 20 blocks that constituted the commercial heart of Bumpy Johnson's territory, the change was tangible. Black customers were seated at window tables. Black families were greeted at the door. Black women walked into restaurants with the expectation of dignity, and that expectation was met because behind every plate of food and every poured glass of wine stood the invisible presence of a man who carried a pearl earring in his breast pocket and had proven, definitively, that he meant what he said. The criminal world absorbed the lesson with equal clarity, but different vocabulary. In the coded language of organized crime, the Saratelli incident became shorthand for a boundary that must never be crossed. Families are off limits. This was not a new principle. The Italian Mafia had operated under a similar code for generations, at least in theory. But Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that the principle applied not only within the hermetic world of organized crime, but extended outward to the street, to the restaurant, to the public square. It was not enough to refrain from targeting a rival's wife in a business dispute. You also had to ensure that no one under your protection, no one who borrowed your name, no one who paid you tribute would treat that wife, or any wife, with contempt. The umbrella of respect covered not just the absence of violence, but the presence of dignity. Tony Bender understood this. Within 2 weeks of the incident, he sent word to every Italian business owner operating in Harlem who paid tribute to the Genovese family, and there were dozens, that any man who created problems with the local community would find his protection withdrawn. The exact language of Bender's message was never recorded, but the substance was relayed through intermediaries and understood perfectly. Vito does not want another Saratelli. Behave. If a black customer walks into your establishment, you treat them like a customer. If you cannot do that, close your business and move to Brooklyn. This was not altruism. This was risk management. The Genovese family generated significant revenue from Harlem. Gambling, numbers, loan sharking, protection, and that revenue depended on a stable relationship with the neighborhood's power structure, which meant a stable relationship with Bumpy Johnson. One dead restaurant owner was an acceptable loss. A disruption of the entire Harlem revenue stream was not. Bender's directive was business, not morality, but the effect was the same. Italian-owned businesses in Harlem began treating their black customers with a respect that had been conspicuously absent for decades, and the catalyst for this transformation was not a civil rights march or a legislative act or a newspaper editorial. It was a pearl earring and 7 words on a note card and the cold mathematics of a man who had decided that his wife's dignity was worth more than any alliance, any treaty, any calculation of risk and reward. 99% of people would have weighed the consequences, would have considered the Genovese connection, would have calculated the odds, and concluded that one insult, however vile, was not worth the potential destruction of everything they had built. But Bumpy Johnson was the 1% who understood something that calculators and strategists miss, that there are moments when calculation itself becomes cowardice, when the only correct response is absolute and immediate and total, because anything less announces to the world that your principles have a price, and once the world knows your principles have a price, the bidding begins, and it never stops. There was another consequence of that October night, quieter, more personal, and in some ways more revealing than the public transformation of Lenox Avenue. In the 21 years between the Saratelli incident and Bumpy's passing, not a single person in Harlem's criminal ecosystem, not a rival, not an enemy, not a reckless newcomer trying to make a name, ever targeted, threatened, insulted, or even spoke disrespectfully about Mayme Johnson. Not once. This was not merely the result of fear, though fear was certainly part of it. It was the result of something that functioned more like a natural law than a social convention, an understanding so deeply embedded in the collective consciousness of Harlem that it did not need to be spoken or enforced because it was self-evident. You could compete with Bumpy Johnson for territory. People did. Some survived. You could challenge his business operations. People did. Some prospered. You could even, in certain carefully calibrated circumstances, refuse a direct request from Bumpy Johnson and live to tell about it, because Bumpy was a pragmatist who understood that the world required flexibility and that rigid men broke while flexible men bent and then straightened. But Mamie was not territory. Mamie was not business. Mamie was not a negotiable element in the calculus of criminal enterprise. Mamie was the line, the only line that could not be approached, could not be tested, could not be probed for weakness. And behind that line stood not a gangster, not a businessman, not a strategist, but a man with 9 words carved into his bones and a pearl earring next to his heart. The young men who entered Harlem's criminal world in the 1960s, a new generation, harder in some ways, more political in others, shaped by the civil rights movement and the emerging Black Power philosophy, learned the Saratelli story as part of their informal education. It was told to them by older men, by the veterans of Bumpy's era, and it was told not as a war story or a boast, but as a lesson in principle. This is what it means to be a man. This is where the line is. This is what happens when someone crosses it. The details varied with each telling. The number of grappas Saratelli consumed grew from 7 to 12 in some versions. The pearl earring became a diamond brooch in others. The 7 words on the note card became 10 or 12, or simply an unprintable phrase. But the core remained constant. A man spat in a woman's face, and by morning that man was gone, and the woman's husband carried a piece of her jewelry in his pocket for the rest of his life. By the early 1970s, the story had transcended its origins as a Harlem crime narrative and entered the broader folklore of Black New York. It was referenced in conversations about dignity and self-defense and the limits of nonviolent resistance. It appeared, thinly disguised, in at least 2 novels set in Harlem and 1 off-Broadway play that ran for 3 weeks at a small theater on 125th Street. A spoken-word poet named David Henderson performed a piece titled Pearl at the Apollo Theater in 1974 that contained the lines, "He carried her honor in his pocket, small and white and round, and the whole avenue bowed, because a man who answers for his wife answers for his people." The audience gave Henderson a standing ovation, and he later admitted that he had never met Bumpy Johnson and had learned the story from a bartender on 7th Avenue who may or may not have been present at La Stella that night. The story even reached the Italian community in ways that surprised those who expected resentment. Among the older generation of Italian Americans in East Harlem and the Bronx, men who had grown up in a culture that placed family honor at the center of masculine identity, the Saratelli incident was discussed with something closer to respect than outrage. The consensus expressed in the kitchens and social clubs of Arthur Avenue and Pleasant Avenue was surprisingly consistent. The man disgraced himself. You do not spit at a woman, any woman. If the husband responded, that is what husbands do. Saratelli brought it on himself. This was not universal. There were those who viewed the incident as an unacceptable violation of the established order, an act of black aggression against an Italian businessman that should have been met with retaliation. But these voices were in the minority, and they were further marginalized by the fact that Vito Genovese himself, through Tony Bender, had essentially endorsed Bumpy's action by declining to respond. When the boss says the dead man deserved it, arguing otherwise is not just futile, it is dangerous. And so the story settled into the sedimentary layers of New York history, compressed by time into something dense and hard and permanent. It was not in the textbooks. It was not in the official histories of Harlem or the authorized biographies of civil rights leaders or the academic studies of organized crime in mid-century America. It lived in the space between official history and lived experience, the space where most of the important truths about how cities actually function are stored, accessible not through libraries and archives, but through conversations and memories, and the particular tone of voice that older men use when they are telling a younger man something that matters. 21st century. The apartment building on 150th Street still stands. The storefront where La Stella once served veal and humiliation has been through 6 different businesses since 1958. The barber shop lasted until '63, followed by a record store, a laundromat, a fried chicken joint, a cell phone repair shop, and currently a nail salon. No plaque marks the location. No historical marker notes that this was the site where a restaurant owner made a mistake that cost him everything. The alley behind the building has been paved over and partially blocked by a chain-link fence. The fire escape that 2 nameless men climbed on an October night is rusted but still attached to the building's rear facade, its ladder permanently retracted, its lowest platform 12 feet above ground level. The Neptune Bar closed in 1981. Jackson's Billiard Hall burned in a fire in 1970 and was replaced by a grocery store. The 128th Precinct was consolidated into a larger unit in 1972. Detective Cosgrove retired in 1969 and passed away in 1984 in a nursing home in Queens without ever publicly discussing the Saratelli case. Sergeant McCarthy transferred to a desk job in Brooklyn in 1959, 2 years after the incident, and never returned to Harlem. Nat Pettigrew outlived nearly everyone in this story. He was still sitting in that barbershop chair on 7th Avenue in 1985, still drinking coffee from a paper cup, still carrying secrets in his head that would have filled volumes if he had ever chosen to share them. He did not attend Bumpy's funeral in 1968, not because of disrespect, but because, as he told a friend, I said goodbye to Bumpy in a billiard hall in '57. Everything after that was borrowed time, and I am grateful for every minute of it. He passed away in 1987 at 81 in his own bed, in his own apartment, with a cup of coffee on the nightstand, a death that, by the standards of his profession and his era, constituted a miracle of longevity. Jimmy Lee Williams drove for 3 more employers after Bumpy's passing, but he never spoke about any of them with the reverence he reserved for Johnson. In a 1982 interview with the Harlem community newspaper, he was asked to name the most memorable night of his career as a driver. He answered without hesitation, October 12, 57, the night the air in my car turned cold. He refused to elaborate. The interviewer pressed. Jimmy Lee shook his head. Some stories are not for newspapers, young man. Some stories are for barbershops, and barbershop stories stay in the barbershop. Mayme Johnson lived until 2009. She was 98 years old. In her final years, she gave occasional interviews about Bumpy, always careful, always dignified, always protective of his memory in the way that a curator protects a collection, allowing access to certain pieces while keeping others behind glass. When asked about the Saratelli incident specifically, and she was asked because by the 2000s the story had become one of the canonical tales of Harlem folklore, she would smile a particular smile that interviewers found impossible to interpret and say, "My husband was a complicated man who lived in complicated times. He did what he believed was right. I did not always agree with his methods, but I never doubted his reasons." She never confirmed the pearl earring. She never denied it. She wore her left pearl earring, the surviving twin, until her eyesight failed in 2005 and she could no longer manage the clasp. After that, the earring sat in a small velvet box on her dresser, next to a photograph of Bumpy in his dark blue suit and fedora, taken sometime in the early 1960s, his breast pocket slightly bulged by something small and round that the camera could not identify, but that Mamie could identify from across any room, in any light, at any distance. When Mayme Johnson passed in 2009, her family found the velvet box on the dresser. Inside was the left pearl earring and a folded piece of paper, yellowed, brittle, written in Bumpy's handwriting. The paper contained no date, no salutation, no context, just 9 words. A man who did not protect his wife is no man. Below the words, in smaller script, a single addition, "For Mamie, always." The family kept the note. They did not share it with journalists or historians or filmmakers. It remained within the family, as Bumpy had intended, a private document, a personal law, a love letter disguised as a declaration of principle, or perhaps a declaration of principle disguised as a love letter. With Bumpy Johnson, the distinction was never entirely clear because for him there was no distinction. Love and law were the same thing. Protection and tenderness were the same thing. The pearl earring and the note in the alley were the same thing. 2 expressions of a single, unwavering, non-negotiable truth that he had carried in his bones since the night a man named Vincent Saratelli made the catastrophic error of believing that a woman in a cream dress with pearl earrings could be humiliated without consequence. She could not. And the consequence arrived before breakfast, and the man who delivered it carried a pearl in his pocket for 21 years, because some debts are not settled when the creditor is gone. Some debts are carried, worn smooth by years of contact with fabric and skin and the steady beating of a heart that refused to forget. A heart that stopped on a July evening in 1968 at a table in Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue with the pearl still in his pocket, still warm from his body heat, still keeping its silent vigil over a promise made on an October night when a man decided that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a gun or a knife or an army. The most dangerous thing in the world is a husband who has just learned that someone spat in his wife's face. And the most permanent thing in the world is the lesson that follows. 9 words, a pearl earring, a note with 7 words pinned to a lapel in a Harlem alley. This is how laws are written, not in legislatures, not in courtrooms, not in books with leather covers and gold-embossed titles. Laws are written in alleys and back rooms and breast pockets. Laws are written by men who lay chess kings on their sides and make 4 phone calls in 13 minutes. Laws are written by women who do not wipe spit from their faces because the spit is not dirt. It is evidence. Laws are written in the 21-year silence between a fallen earring and a closed casket. And the law that Bumpy Johnson wrote on the night of October the 12th, 1957, with a Monte Cristo cigar and a black Cadillac and 14 pairs of eyes on Lenox Avenue and a dishwasher who sold his boss for $50 and a new job, that law was never repealed. It is still in effect. Every stone on these streets knows whose wife she was.